welcome back to Pet Squares. Yeah, I know it's been a long time. I want to apologize for that. Basically, over this summer, there's really only been one story in Beach Boys land. It's the Feel Flows box set. It really took up some of the time, understandably, of some of the people that consult with the show. Also, I didn't really want to step on that story, and I had nothing to say about it myself because I don't even have a copy of the album. I can't get it where I live. But while I'm thinking about that, I want to recommend another YouTube show for you by Jocelyn Hoisington, who does contribute to some of the research that is forwarded to me on this show and also has provided useful critiques from time to time. She has another analysis show specifically directed at the songs of Feel Flows. It's a different vibe from this show, but very, very cool. So I highly recommend that to you if you need a fix of music analysis for Feel Flows. One other thing, a couple other things. I've been upgrading a little bit. I've got a green screen, pretty cool, huh? I've got a lavalier mic now, which I can't seem to get at a reasonable volume, so hopefully this isn't distorting too much, but some of you have wished for a little clearer audio, so hopefully this will do it for you. And also, I have some new creative projects outside of this show that I want to tell you about really briefly. I just finished remixing one of my old albums, an album called The Owl and the Full Moon. It's up on Bandcamp. It sounds really, really good, and if you're a fan of the Beach Boys, you're probably going to enjoy a lot of the harmony singing on it. If you check out a video on this channel for a song called Song 11, that will give you an idea of what to expect on the album, and I would love it if you checked it out. You can stream it for free, download it if it moves you. The other thing I want to tell you is I'm about to debut a new show on this channel. It's a new music show. It's called Beautiful Bombs. And it's about some of the most unsuccessful and yet best songs that were released as singles in the rock era. And it's going to be a more digestible format than the Pet Squares show. It's going to be shorter, it's going to be sharper, but still hopefully some good detail, some good critical analysis, some high production values, at least as best as I can make them. I have completed 2 episodes but not yet uploaded them, but by the time you watch this, if it hasn't been released yet, it very shortly will be. So please check out Beautiful Bombs, and if you like it, recommend it to the whole dang world. Anyway, I think that covers everything, so let's get right to it. Today we are covering Shut Down Volume 2, the Beach Boys' 5th album. Shut Down Volume 2 comes out in February of 1964. It only reaches number 13 on the American charts, which is a fairly significant drop-off from the top 10 placings of the previous 3 albums. Shut Down Volume 2 is thusly named because, again, Capitol had released a highly successful compilation album called Shut Down that went top 10, somewhat on the basis of the name recognition for the Beach Boys, even though they only had 2 songs on it. This motivated Brian to rush release the Little Deuce Coupe album, which we talked about exhaustively on the last 2 episodes, but he was still trying to get a little bit of that commercial action from the previous year's hit, hence Shut Down Volume 2. This is widely believed to be the weakest of the early albums. It's also sort of the last of the early albums. There's definitely a transition after this to more ambitious work. I'm sure it's no coincidence, in fact I know it's no coincidence, that the Beatles arrived stateside during the recording of this album, thus sort of goading Brian's ambitions and making the band feel somewhat threatened, especially given that they were on the same label, Capitol Records. But a lot of other things were going on at this time. Something that's worth remembering is the iconic image of the Beach Boys, the striped shirts, the classic 5, Brian, Al, Carl Dennis, and Mike. That band existed as a reality for only a little over a year, from fall of '63 to the end of '64. That was about as long as Brian could manage to keep it up, being a full-time touring member of the band and producing everything and continuing to further his ambitions as an outside producer. As we go through this year and talk about it, you will begin to see why it's no wonder that he cracked up by the end of the year. Even if we take away the mental health issues that were about to onset, you had just an unbelievable workload. You had a dysfunctional family situation, and it's really quite amazing that Brian made it through '64. Going both to the pressures of touring and to the pressures of the family situation, During the recording of Shutdown Volume 2 in January and February of 1964, the band made its first big overseas trip. They went to Australia and New Zealand with Brian and Murray in tow. Murray had already made himself a thorn in the band's side on the road. He was fighting them for doing such horrible things as fraternizing with women and drinking. As you can imagine, this created some stress. He would fine the band if he caught them disobeying his orders, and this fine went up to $1,000 per infraction on the Australian tour. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. Brian was sick of Murray interfering with everything that they were doing. Brian and Mike came to a joint decision on return from Australia, and they seem to have fired Murray within a week or two after that. And there are session tapes from the Shutdown Volume 2 album that indicate that he had just been removed from the picture, and the band is making fun of him and showing considerable relief. It's just worth remembering as we review this album that this is the beginning of the ticking time bomb. There's just too much going on. You have the Beatles coming in, challenging the band's hegemony as the #1 band in the US. You have Brian now having full control of the band with Murray out of the picture, but also having way too much on his plate. You have the increasing artistic ambitions on the records. There's just a lot building up. So watch how things develop as we go through 64, because it starts here. Now, Shutdown Volume 2, as I said, sort of has a reputation of being not that great of an album. I think the inclusion of a couple of really, really blatantly obvious filler pieces tend to sink its reputation a little bit. But this is partly a product of Brian now having to balance his touring responsibilities with producing the band. It had to come out somewhere. And for every sort of amazing Brian track we get from here on in, that's going to take time out of his scheduling budget. And you can see how a Bull session with Big Daddy or a Cassius Love versus Sonny Wilson or a Louie might be necessary just to get the damn album done. Okay, let's start right in on fun. And before I get into this one, I want to acknowledge, as I always do, very significant contributions from Craig Slowinski and the people that research for him. Also on this episode, I was consulting Alan Boyd, the Beach Boys archivist, and also Andrew Doe, who maintains the Bellagio10452.com website, which also was a resource for researching this episode. Unless I tell you otherwise, the band on these tracks is Brian on piano, Alan on bass, Carl on guitar, Dennis on drums and percussion. Now, on Fun, we have a few of the Wrecking Crew guys, this sort of skeleton Wrecking Crew, if you will, that Brian has been using throughout 63. Hal Blaine on drums and percussion, Ray Pullman on various forms of bass, and Steve Douglas and Jay Migliori on saxes. The final lineup on this track was Dennis on tambourine and some minimal drumming. Most of the drumming was Hal Blaine. Ray Pullman played bass, Al Jardine played acoustic guitar. Everybody else was exactly what you'd expect, Steve Ajay on saxes and you know, basically everybody else. Now, Mike and Brian wrote this track. They sort of humorously argued over the details of when this happened, but it pretty much seems to have occurred in Salt Lake City. There are two stories about how they got their inspiration for this. One is that a radio station manager that they were visiting, a disc jockey, told them that this had occurred with the radio station manager's daughter, that he basically lied to his boss to go out and go to the local hamburger stand. But a different version of the story is that this is actually something that happened with Dennis, where a girl snuck out to be with Dennis, and Dennis was quite proud of this. Either way, Brian and Mike derived some inspiration from this, and of course it's widely thought that the hamburger stand was inspired by the Foster's Freeze and Hawthorne. Another interesting thing that I learned during the research for this that I didn't know is Murray apparently objected strongly to the lyrical content of this song. You can see he's just winning friends everywhere at this point. He thought that the narrative of the children disobeying the parent was immoral. What a shock. So he apparently boycotted the vocal sessions for this. As I've said, or it's possible that he was just fired at that point. I don't know the chronology. I do know that the band started recording this album on January 1st of 1964 with the session for this and for Warmth of the Sun. So a pretty amazing session for high quality recordings. Fun, as I should have said in the beginning, was a major hit despite the Beatles holding down the top 3 positions on the Billboard Hot 100. It made it to number 5. Really impressive work given the commercial landscape at the time. It's a great record. The track, however they got there, it just chugs. The eighth note piano, the beat. It's a really interesting song. It seems like it's a lot simpler than it is. There's a bunch of sort of games Brian plays with the standard 1-4-5 progressions, including shifting the home key during the solo. Which makes this, if you're playing it live and you think you're going to be able to wing it because it sounds easy, this song can really trip you up if you're playing it. I can tell you that for free. There's also an incredible fade out on this that the Beach Boys learned to work during their concerts fairly quickly and forever after that. But on one of the early mixes, I don't remember which one because there were several mixes, but they basically fade the band out almost immediately, leaving the vocals sort of sitting there lamely doing an a cappella thing. And what a waste of a great part. That ending part is just one of the great fade outs, and I can't believe someone actually did that fade out and cheated the whole deal, but they did. This was probably written during the band's September 1963 trip to Salt Lake City because David Marks reported that he had worked up a version with them, and it apparently was a slow blues at that point. And in fact, later in the year when they were working on the concert album and they were short of usable tracks, they actually played around with trying to do fun in the earlier blues motif and basically gave up on that. Some very strong lyrics from Mike. 1964 is probably Mike Love's peak year as a good lyricist, as we will discuss later. So, speaking of Stone classics, next up we have Don't Worry Baby, and it really doesn't get any more classic than this. You know, for some of the songs that we're covering, especially when we get into this time frame, they are such a part of the American songbook now. It's really hard to think of new things to say about them. In terms of the band's vocal blend, we've now crossed into something like Transcendence, where the emotional resonance of the song is part and parcel with the band's vocal blend. You have Brian doing a magnificent falsetto lead vocal, and in fact, Alan Boyd theorizes that perhaps this was where Chuck Britt started using an SM57 on Brian's falsetto leads. This is basically a cheap microphone that is not often used in the studio for lead vocals, but Chuck Britt found that Brian sounded really good on it, and so he started using it at some point. Speaking of curious choices, there's a big honking mistake, or at least an odd note choice on the bass at 1 minute and 35 seconds, and it should be noted that at one point Brian took credit for the bass guitar on this, but it is indeed Al Jardine. But one interesting thing about the credits on this song is David Marks, personally to me, and I don't know if this was well known before that or not, claimed that the sort of heart-choking rhythm/lead break on this, which is overdubbed on Brian's lead vocal track, was his, not Carl's. He claims that this is his one and only lead guitar performance on a Beach Boys record, one where he's basically not playing anything, although it is, in my opinion, for all its simplicity, one of the greatest guitar breaks in rock history. Just the way, it's like a choking sob. David's story is that he was visiting a session, the band wasn't around, and Brian just was doing a vocal and asked him to cut the guitar track. I have attempted to verify whether this is true or not. All the experts can say is that they cannot disprove this story. It does line up with the track lineup. We do know that David Marks visited other sessions on this album, and I don't know why David would lie about it. So apparently the lead guitar break if you want to call it a lead guitar break on this, was David Marks. So that's a bit of trivia for you. The lyrics are, as most people know by now, not as romantic as they sound. They're basically about a guy that basically talked himself into a car race, and he's afraid they're going to pick him up in about 1,000,000 pieces. His girlfriend is reassuring him that this isn't going to happen. I don't know how she's so sure, but this apparently is reflected in something Marilyn, Brian's girlfriend and soon-to-be wife, would say to Brian when he would start to get stressed out. Don't worry, baby. In terms of its chart performance, it later became a high-charting B-side when it was released with I Get Around. It made it to, I believe, number 24. I'll put it up here. B.J. Thomas later had a big hit with it in the 1970s, rewriting the car part. Basically, that's what everyone did when they covered it. They just obscured the fact that it's about a drag race, which Brian thought was very funny, incidentally. He sort of got the innate humor of that. Something that it's not well realized is this was originally written for Ronnie Spector. It was inspired by Big Shock, Be My Baby, hence Don't Worry Baby. It later was an influence on Mr. Tambourine Man, which was produced by Terry Melcher, who was partner with Bruce Johnson, who would shortly join the Beach Boys. So everything's all in one big, beautiful little ball. But anyway, Don't Worry Baby, certainly one of the finest tracks they ever did. The way the vocals sell the emotion of the song, you really don't give a crap if it's about a car race or not. This is one of the best examples of the vocal blend and the arrangement choices, especially that guitar sort of non-solo that David did, non-verbally expressing emotion. You know, this is a great example of that, and I think any idiot can listen to Don't Worry Baby and understand that concept. Next we have In the Parking Lot, which is probably one of those songs that people look at when they say, yeah, there's a lot of kind of weak songs on this. I wouldn't call it weak so much as peculiar. You have this doo-wop intro, then a tempo change into sort of the fun beat. It's an odd juxtaposition. There's a very cool but also kind of dissonant harmony coming out of the, I guess you'd call it the chorus, the turning on the radio dial bit. It's just an odd little song. There's more Spector influence on the backup vocals, Do-Ron-De-Ron-De from Do-Ron-Do-Ron, Do-Ron-Ron, Papa Do-Ron-Ron, whatever the hell that thing was called. The Do-Ron-Ron, I know what it was called. I'm just being stupid. The lyrics also, I think this is a mic track. I should have it written here. I don't. If it's not, I'll put it there. Handy to have that space right there. It's kind of cool. It's a cool narrative, also kind of weird. I like the Here Comes the News, No Time to Lose couplet, because it really puts you in the car and you're thinking, oh, they're making out in the car, but now they got to make it to their first class. But also, it's kind of a strange rhyme. It's kind of strange. So In the Parking Lot for me is, I can't decide if it's really cool or just really weird and a lot of things that don't really go together. In the recording of this, there's a little bit of oddity there. Because if you listen to the track, the drums drop out at 1 minute and 22 seconds in. And why this is peculiar is if you listen to the session tapes and also the stereo version of this song, if you listen carefully enough, it becomes clear that there were two drum tracks. And there was the original one, and then there was an overdub. But what it appears happened is that the original drum track was mixed out except for the part with the tom-toms. And I don't have any idea why they would have done this, but it's what I theorize also happened on the rather controversial No Go Showboat from the last album. And again, one of the great arguments at that time was, why the hell would he do that? And the answer is, I don't know. But it seems like he did it here, and I think he did it at least one other time on the Surfing USA album. He did apparently sometimes track the drums and then wipe them and put new drums on. That does appear to be what happened here. There are at least drum overdubs on this, possibly more than that, but you know, me listening to the tracks very carefully, I couldn't verify if there was more than drums overdubbed or not, but definitely drums. Anyway, I don't know how I feel about the song. It's just weird. Next up, Cassius Love versus Sonny Wilson. This is one of those notorious tracks, right up there with Here Comes the Night disco version, Summer of Love, and Hey Little Tomboy. What the hell were they thinking? This is, of course, sort of a filler comedy track where the band pretends to have an argument during a rehearsal. There's a lot of things about this track that were not immediately apparent to me the first time I heard it. The first is that the band actually did recut live versions of these songs in the studio to sort of edit into this track. So these aren't, as it appeared to me the first time I ever heard this when I was 15 or something, just instrumental tracks from the original recordings. No, they really actually recut all these songs. But curiously, even though they are supposedly rehearsing for a show, we have Brian on piano and not on bass. I don't know why. So anyway, so then they cut all those things together, and then the stereo panning does them no favors because it just becomes really confusing who's doing what, who's saying what. The whole concept just doesn't work for me because the first time I ever heard it, I just didn't get it. Even when Brian's supposedly imitating Mike, I never could really hear the difference, and honestly, I still can't. Mike imitating Brian, it's also not immediately clear until Mike just starts going, like apparently he does when he sings up there. Why they were motivated to do this, I don't know, but as I said earlier, at 64 is when we have the iconic and short-lived in real life classic Beach Boys band lineup. I mean, yes, I know it came back in the mid to late 70s. I know that, but it really wasn't the same band. It wasn't, it was different in a lot of ways, even if it was the same 5 people. But this really was a way to introduce the band's personalities. So there's some interesting things about this from that perspective. Al, who did better acting later, I might add, he sounds way too casual. A feud breaks out between Brian and Mike. It's like, oh, really? But you get the sense of Al being sort of the observer, the bystander, Mike and Brian being the main competitive driving leadership forces in the band, Carl being a moderating force, and Dennis, interestingly, defending Mike on sort of macho bro grounds, which, considering their later difficulties with one another, is kind of interesting. Cassius Love versus Sonny Wilson, for those of you who don't know, is a now oblique reference to Muhammad Ali, the great boxer, who at that time was known as Cassius Clay. When he later became a conscientious objector and converted to Islam, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. There was a famous prize fight at that time with Sonny Liston, another champion boxer. I think Ali won. I ought to know. I'm sorry, folks that are older than me. It was before I was born. I'm not quite that old. But anyway, that, for those of you that don't know, that's what Cassius Love versus Sonny Wilson refers to as this famous boxing match. Incidentally, Mike references Brian parodying his singing on Surfin' Safari, and he never actually did. So I don't know if that was something that they tried and got rid of. I don't know. But I got to ask, okay, so this was obviously a filler track. Was this really faster than just bashing out another instrumental like they did on the Surfin' USA album? Because it seems like a lot of work. They had to recut 4 or 5 different versions of songs, and they got to cut it all together, and they got to do this rather crappy acting job. And it all kind of doesn't work in the end. I mean, it's got a certain amount of charm, especially the critical list thing. That's now a famous catchphrase, because Mike certainly was easy to make fun of then and now for his nasal vocal delivery. But one has to assume this was just Brian's way of wanting to find another way to skin that cat of having to have filler for the album. Brian certainly was interested in humorous records, witness his many attempts to make dance crazes out of nursery rhymes, and how much his tongue was firmly planted in cheek on those efforts. So we have to assume that this was Brian's attempt to sort of shake up the formula in maybe not a very artistically fulfilling way, but kudos for trying. But, kind of forced humor and an odd choice for 4th position on the album. I mean, you're putting this right up front. So again, I think this track is a lot of the reason why this album retrospectively is not thought of as being very strong. Now we have Warmth of the Sun, once again, a Stone classic. An incredibly substantial composition, a high watermark for Mike Love as a lyricist. When people defend his lyric writing, this is the song they always go to, and indeed, Mike does a beautiful job at getting across the melancholy emotions that he usually was a little uncomfortable with. There are a lot of stories about how the song was written Craig Slowinski sent me his synopsis of it, and it's so beautifully written and captures the mood. I just want to read what he wrote. He said, "On the evening of November 21st, 1963, Brian and Mike set to work on a new song, staying up late into the night. Brian came up with the achingly beautiful melody and unconventional chord structure, and Mike, recalling the recent end of a romantic relationship, proved for the first time that he could translate this type of melancholic musical sentiment into words. By the end of the long night, they were both left with an intangible but overwhelming sense of loss. The next morning, they awoke around 11 o'clock in the morning to hear the news that President Kennedy had just been assassinated in Dallas." So, pretty heavy, and it does make sense that Brian at least might have later confused the sequence of events, because it just seemed to very closely dovetail with the mood of the country and doubtless their mood when they received that tragic news, which for that generation was similar to what 9/11 was for those of us that came later, just a moment you never forget. This was, as I said before, cut at the January 1st session of Fun, Fun, Fun. In this case, Hal Blaine plays percussion. I think it's wind chimes. Dennis plays the drums. Jay and Steve are on sax, very kind of subtle in the background. Al's on bass this time. This may have originally been intended as the B-side of Fun, 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 and then later Brian changed his mind. I think it was later a B-side for something, but I didn't write down what it was because I suck at my job. Sorry about that. You can't really talk about this song without talking about its rather brilliantly unorthodox chord progression. It basically turns the standard doo-wop progression on its head, goes through some really interesting changes. It's worth reminding ourselves that Brian was quite influenced by Disney, kind of the pre-Tin Pan Alley jazz background. And also, I have to wonder, in terms of the really unconventional key changes that happen in the song, if Brian wasn't a little influenced by Jan Berry, because I talked a little bit on the bonus episode where Jan really liked these almost violent modulations that were pretty unconventional, and the way this jumps up, famously up a minor third in the verse, which is very revolutionary move in chord theory for pop music at the time, at least for this kind of pop music. I gotta wonder if Brian didn't sort of think about the stuff Jan was doing and think I could do that, but make it a little more musical, which she did here. It's such an amazing progression. Oh, I misspoke. I believe Al is on acoustic guitar on this, which means who's on bass? Okay, I'm going to write it up here. I don't know who's on bass. I'm very confused now. I suck. I suck at my job. So let's take a quick run around the chords of The Warmth of the Sun, because they're pretty amazing. This is a real truncated, dumbed down version of it, leaving a lot of stuff out. But basically the first going into the first chorus, something like this. Brian starts out with a basic doo-wop progression, 1 to a minor 6. Then up a minor third, same progression. Up a whole step to a minor 7, to the relative major, then going into the chorus to the 5 of the new key, which is A major 7, A minor 7, D11, G major 7. Wow. This Car of Mine, another muscular vocal showcase for Dennis. As usual with Dennis, a lot of personality. As Carl Wilson once pointed out, he just had so much personality in his delivery, it didn't really matter. It's a fairly simplistic song. Again, Dion influence, especially at the end, the diddly ho ho, which was probably a little nod to Dennis's preferences. Dennis tries to freestyle his vocal a little at the end. It's pretty lame. It wasn't his strong suit, at least at that point, but hey, he gave it a shot. One of my fondest memories of this song was seeing Alex Chilton perform it at the Morgan Wixon Theater the same night that Brian played, and he famously saw the Wonderments with me, I might add. But I was in the audience seeing Alex Chilton do it, and he didn't really know the song. And I remember he's like leaning into the audience for a vocal cue, and he goes, "No clunker!" It's like, yeah, someone had cued it, and he remembered it. It was really charming. I love Alex Chilton. This car of mine, what more can I say? It's a car, it's his. Why do fools fall in love? Okay, this has a little bit of a different recording history. For this session, which was done at Gold Star, which was Spector's favorite studio, Brian basically gave himself a little fanboy moment. He got all of Spector's favorite musicians together, what we now call the Wrecking Crew. He did a whole thing. He did a whole Spector thing, a whole Spector wannabe thing. He picked this old song, which was originally done by Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers back in 1956. Did a really sparkling vocal arrangement. The breakdown in the middle, the vocal breakdown, that "Why do fools fall in love?" That's a hair in the back of your neck moment. That's really, really cool. And actually, another cool thing about this track that I learned during the research is that Mike actually sang live with the band. He did the dot doo dot doo dot did it. He's right there with the band, partly probably for timing reasons, but that's a live vocal, which I can't think of too many times they did that, and particularly Mike. So that's kind of cool. Brian had the Wrecking Crew guys play the whole song, and then he played it again. I know there was some controversy over whether or not there were two bands. We exhaustively talked about this last episode on a song called No Go Showboat. Here there is no controversy whatsoever. They definitely overdubbed the band again. And you know, it sounds as you'd expect, pretty chaotic mess of sound there in the background. So I don't have any trouble believing that. But you know, he got his wall of sound. He had his little moment, and this wound up being the B-side of Fun, Fun, Fun. It charted at number 120 as a B-side. It's very different sonically because of its origins as the rest of the album. It only exists as mono, or at least only did until the session tapes were famously rediscovered by John Stebbins, I think, was the guy that found the tapes, and then Alan Boyd and Mark Lynette were able to generate some stereo mixes from the session tapes from this. It sounds bigger and smaller at the same time, if that makes any sense. Something about taking all those instruments and then sort of cramming them into a little ball. It's an example of how Brian was better when he was Brian doing Spector rather than trying to be Spector, if that makes any sense. Brian doing his own sort of weird take on Spector. Like, Brian has often said that he never topped Spector, and which we all think is crazy, but I think what Brian's trying to say is not that he did crap work, but that in terms of what turned him on about Spector, the thing he was trying to get at, he could never get at. Now, the Brian Wilson thing, the thing we all love about Brian, that was never operational for Spector. Terry Melcher said that Spector's sound was about aggression, about asserting dominance, and Brian's was about love searching for approval. And I think that is very accurate, and it goes a long way to explaining the difference between their approaches, even if Brian was trying, especially at this period, very hard to mimic, at least in part, what Phil Spector was doing. Pom Pom Play Girl. Now this one's kind of interesting because we now have the proper lead vocal debut of Carl Wilson. He did do little bits and pieces here and there, most notably on Summertime Blues. Yes, indeed. Singing with somebody else. This is Carl's first proper solo lead vocal. And this is something that people that are younger or not really deep into band lore, something that you wouldn't have any reason to know, but this went unnoticed for a very long time. If you look at the CD twofers from the late 80s, their credits on this song and also on prior books written about the band, Girl Don't Tell Me, which comes a few albums later, was credited as Carl's first lead vocal. This track was a minor song on a minor album, and Carl hadn't really developed as a singer, and so nobody really noticed. And there's nothing really wrong with the vocal. In fact, it's got quite a lot of character. But I find it a very interesting vocal because we basically hear Carl, the high school student. He sounds very close to the topic. Like this lyric about sort of a stuck-up cheerleader type, he's singing it like a guy going to high school that observes this phenomenon and just has no use for it. His lead vocal is a little bit of disgust, a little bit of detachment, and a little bit of being jaded. And I think another reason for this is there's some evidence the reason it took Carl so long to do a lead vocal is he didn't really want to sing lead. In fact, Brian makes reference on Girl Don't Tell Me that he finally wrote a song that Carl dug singing, which implies that Carl didn't like this song very much. And in fact, it never was revisited again except in a very brief, they played a verse of it in the 70s for no apparent reason. I don't know why. But Carl just sounds like, especially at the end, he's going, wow, yeah, shake those pom-poms all around. So it's a combination of he's very close to the subject matter. The song's not that great, and he just doesn't seem like he wants to be there. and then you have this timpani that's kind of going boing, which sort of adds to the sort of doleful comic way Carl's handling it. And apparently, from what we can tell, that was Dennis playing either a timpani or a floor tom. But Carl's vocal is so sort of isolated off in the distance, not in the distance, but it's quite clearly on its own track with this timpani or floor tom, that I always just visualized him playing it himself, like, boom, shake those pom-poms all around. And, you know, I don't know, I'm sure it was Dennis, but I have a hard time getting that visual out of my head. But there's something about this track, and I may be reading too much into it, but how it feels like Carl felt about it, where he's almost like the perfect guy to sing the song because he just sounds like he has no use for the person he's singing about. He has not much use for the song, and he's there under duress, but he's going to perform it thusly. And so I think it shows us a side of Carl, you know, as a very young man that we don't usually see or visualize. And you know, I never met Carl. I've certainly met quite a number of people who had met Carl, and one of the things that I've sort of pieced together about his personality from all these different people that talking to me about him is, and also some of the tapes I've heard, is he did have a very strong sense of his own opinions. If he thought something sucked, you know, you weren't going to tell him otherwise. And I think he had that kind of backbone almost from the very beginning. So, you know, Carl, I think, as wonderful of a man as he is, and as universally beloved as he was, he seemed to have a stubborn streak, you know, and I just have a feeling he didn't dig this song very much. Mike also sings on the choruses. I also think his singing on this is hilarious. That really ought to make her telephone ring. Oh, and then at the end, the modulation's going up and up and up and up. They're insane. You know, I don't think anybody took the song very seriously, but yeah, you know, wow. To quote Carl, wow. It was co-written by Gary Usher, very late in the game for him. He, of course, was heavily featured on the first album and in little spots after that. This may be his last composition with Brian. He had moved on to other things, including very shortly to be producing The Birds, which I talk about in the first episode of Beautiful Bombs, which you'll be seeing on this channel in the not-too-distant future. Next we have Keep an Eye on Summer, another co-write between Brian and his roommate and buddy Bob Norberg. It's a beautiful melody. Again, the progression is quite advanced and interesting. Again, Brian is messing with the doo-wop formula, taking standard progression and then kind of flipping it on its head. Brian liked the song as he redid it on his Imagination solo record in 1998. A very impressive tag with a very tricky modulation, which they almost nail. not quite, but again, something to understand is the imperfections, especially when I called Dennis out for them, because he was the one most often that didn't quite nail the backup vocals. That's part of the charm of the record. I would vastly prefer that little bit of uncertainty, that little bit of right on the edgeness of the band's sound at this time that adds to the spontaneity and the freshness of the harmony sound. Much better that than sort of the heavily processed auto-tuned vibe that came much later. So it's not a diss at all. Speaking of spontaneous things and being right on the edge, some very curious guitar chords at 2 minutes and 7 seconds. Sounds like Carl got on the wrong fret there for a couple of chords. You listen for that. It's once you hear it, it's pretty funny. Shutdown Part 2. Carl wrote it, even though it's pretty much your standard stuff. Mike's sax is back. Mike actually plays sax on several songs on this album. His last appearance in the studio as an instrumentalist, to the best of my knowledge. Pretty obviously edited in at the beginning of the song. Some pretty cool guitar effects with the Leslie, really tight band performance. In fact, there was this big controversy last album, like I said, about whether or not there were two bands on a song called No Go Showboat, and one of the reasons it was widely thought that there are apparently two bands on this. And I did have to get out the headphones pretty carefully to verify this, but yeah, it does sound like they actually played once and then they played it again. And given the sound of the tightness of it and the fact that there's not any leakage on the track, I would say they have now discovered headphones. I would have a very hard time believing they didn't use headphones on this. But once again, this doesn't change what I said on the prior one, because there are noticeable, verifiable differences between the two band performances, and it's a much, everyone's just going da 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 da. So provided they had cans, that's cans is what we call headphones. That's for that length of time, yeah, that's totally doable. But there are some noticeable differences in the performances, a couple of differences in the guitar. Dennis drops the beat at one point, but I gotta say, impressively tight recording, and there are indeed, at least from what I can tell, two discrete band performances. And there's an actual logical reason for that, because they had 3 tracks, there are no vocals on it, they had nothing better to do. So unlike the prior situation where they're under a real time crunch and it didn't really make sense to try that kind of experiment, this would be a perfect time to do it, and it worked out really, really good. So Adam votes yes on 2 bands on this track, and very impressive work by the band here. By the way, on the place that Dennis drops out, I love how it sounds like he stops a few beats short on one of the tracks to make sure the part coming up, he gets it right, like he's mustering his energy to not screw up the fill. He's getting very focused, so that's kind of cool. Louie. Okay, I think this is another reason why this album gets such a bad rap, because did the world really need another version of Louie? Well, I have to say, for me, this was actually, it may have been the first version of it I ever heard, and that proved very advantageous for me as a musician, because on this one you can actually hear the words, and so I actually was able to learn the words and perform them at the drop of a hat. If I had a show that needed pepping up, I could always pull that out of my fanny. The lead vocals on this are apparently Carl and Mike, and I say apparently because Carl and Mike are adopting sort of vocal personas that aren't really theirs. The second verse is very clearly Mike. The first verse is fairly clearly Carl. The third verse seems to also be Carl, but if you revealed a session tape to me that said it was Brian or Mike, I'd be like, oh, okay, they're trying to sound like that. Another reason that it's a little hard to tell with the third verse is the vocals are ducked there. They're pulled down. And that brings me to a very curious thing. The research team for Craig, they theorized that that this is Brian playing with the faders and he's not really on the track. And there's been slight controversy between me and that group from time to time because of sort of the differences between how they listen to it to some of these things and me having spent a lot of time in the studio, we might draw different conclusions from ambiguous data, which I think is good, actually, because we're trying to get at the truth of what happened with these recordings. It does not mean I'm always right. In fact, I'm very clear that I'm sometimes quite wrong. But I have to say that I was like, really? Brian's playing with the knobs? And I listened to this really carefully. I think they're right. As weird as this explanation is, that's exactly what it sounds like. It sounds like someone's in the booth fussing with the knobs and, okay, let's bring Mike up here now, let's pull him down, let's do this. And the only people with political power to do that would be Brian or Murray. And an alternate explanation might be that Murray decided, I'm going to surge here and I'm going to surge there, and Brian just is like, okay, we're done. You are not messing with my recordings anymore. So there's an alternate theory that it was Murray playing with the knobs, but apparently someone is playing with the knobs on the vocals for no apparent reason, which is why you don't hear Carl in the third verse and suddenly hear Mike and they don't hear Mike. And yeah, listen to it with headphones and you're going like, what's going on here? This is just bizarre. So anyway, I'm in agreement. That's what it sounds like. Whatever. Louie, what are you going to do? It's something that they were doing live. Oh, one important thing about this, though. Brian plays bass. This is the only track on this album, to the best of my knowledge, where he does. That also may be relevant to him apparently not singing on it. But, who knows what's going on with this track. It's just weird. Finally, we get to Denny's Drums, written by Dennis Wilson. No sign of future glories here, but it was believed by some people because the narrative that Dennis didn't do his own drumming and Hal Blaine was doing it all, that it was so entrenched that some people believed that Hal Blaine was doing this. And, really? Hal was not going to click his sticks on the tape, or this is just obviously not Hal. I mean, this is obviously not a session drummer. Now, as such, Dennis, I think part of the reason is that this isn't going to set the world on fire is a drumming showcase, but he plays perfectly well. And I think it was hard for people to accept that Dennis was a competent drummer. But, he was. He had his own style, and it was really good at some things and not as good as others. But, he did a thing. And it was what was required. And, on a lot of these tracks, I've noticed there seemed to be a lot of Brian asking Dennis to overdub just a snare or just a tom-tom or keep things really, really simple. And this is something they carried throughout their history. This is really focused on the 2 and the 4 of the beat and keeping things pretty straight, not using a lot of cymbals, not using a lot of hi-hat. Besides being a very exciting live drummer, Dennis also was on board with this aesthetic. When he was in the studio, he played it pretty cool. He did what he was asked to do, and you see this carry over to when Carl was producer and when Dennis was producing his own stuff. The idea that the drums were there to serve the song. Not everybody in the 60s got that memo. Dennis, for all his wildness, he did. You have to give him credit for that. Consider he just started playing 3 years prior. So, for a self-taught guy, he came a long way. Interestingly, there was a band version of this that was attempted and quickly abandoned, but there was a version of this with more than just the drums. But, closing with this, I think this is another sign the band was having a little bit of trouble coming up with material. Again, Brian now having to tour with the men, can't sit at home devising ideas. He's starting to be under a lot of pressure. But having Denny's Drums close the album probably goes a long way, along with Louie and Cassius Love, to why this album has such a bad rep. But, fun, warmth of the sun, Don't Worry Baby, Why Do Fools Fall in Love. There's a lot of good stuff in this record. The progression is definitely continuing for Brian. Maybe there's a little bit of a drop-off from Little Deuce Coupe. Well, maybe not from Little Deuce Coupe because that was kind of a rush job, but from the albums prior to that in some places. But the best stuff is still getting better, and pretty soon we're going to really start to see things explode as we get to All Summer Long, which is the next album up, and it's the beginning of Brian's golden middle period. So that pretty much wraps it up for Shutdown Volume 2. I want to thank you for watching. I want to remind you to like and subscribe to the channel. We are nearly at 1,000 subscribers, which is kind of an exciting milestone. I want to remind you to check out the new show, Beautiful Bombs. I want to apologize for the 3-month wait between episodes. I'm actually going to try to record a couple more episodes of Pet Squares in advance because I will soon probably be traveling a bit and it'll be harder for me to edit. But I do want to remind everybody that a lot of work goes into this show. I have a lot of very knowledgeable people and very busy people that I consult with, and then when they give me their information, I try to do my due diligence, and any questions I have, I try to run them down before I pass them on to you. So it's my way of saying, you know, it may sometimes take some time to produce these, but I am trying to add to the body of knowledge about the Beach Boys and do good work. So just be patient with me, and I hope you'll be entertained and informed by future episodes. Also want to remind you that I have a Patreon for this channel. Many of you are already subscribers. That really helps allow me to develop new shows and keep things going here at a high level. So I want to thank you for that, and if you want to subscribe to the channel and see some of the bonus episodes of Pet Squares, just check the link in the first comment. And that's it for me. I'm Adam Marsland. Thanks for watching Pet Squares. I'll see you next time.